On behalf of the entire Niskanen Center staff, thank you for joining us for our first in-person event since March 11th of 2020. I vividly remember sitting in the room next door as a staff, wargaming what the future of our events would look like on the eve of the pandemic shutdown. The past 18 months have been a whirlwind of change, but we are excited to finally be able to gather again while applying what we've learned to allow us to offer a hybrid option for those of you joining us from the comfort of your home. As a reminder, it is a policy of Grand Valley State University that face coverings must be worn while indoors. I now have the privilege to introduce one of our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidates, Samantha Johnson. Samantha is a senior, dual majoring in management and public and nonprofit administration. She is a second-year fellow with the Cook Leadership Academy and serves as one of our 10 lead fellows. Please help me welcome Samantha as she shares her leadership minute.
My name is Samantha Johnson, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. Growing up, I was always someone who avoided vulnerability. I assumed that everyone I talked to just wanted to hear me make polite small talk about the weather and tell them how great I was doing. CLA has shown me an amazing group of people who care about where I'm really at and who want to help me apply that vulnerability to my leadership style. I remember at my first CLA orientation, we had to make personal timelines of our major life events and describe how they had affected our leadership journeys thus far. I wasn't in a very good place and had really been struggling with the loss of my father just a few months before. I knew that activity was coming up on our second day of orientation, and I contemplated for hours whether or not I was going to share this big and horrible thing that I was dealing with. I didn't want to reveal what felt like such a weakness. But as I heard others share about their lived experiences and the things that they had struggled with, I started to see the place for vulnerability in leadership in a way that I never had before. Leadership doesn't have to mean having it together all of the time. It can mean being a rock or a listening ear for those around you. Being a leader means accepting yourself and others as real, whole people who deal with hard things. Recently, it feels like something is always literally and figuratively on fire. So often now, it is difficult to find common ground with our peers. Especially in today's world, where so many of us have been struggling particularly hard for the past 18 months, people value transparency and vulnerability. People are looking for leaders who are willing to meet them where they are at. And to do that, I now realize you have to be honest about where you're at, too. My name is Samantha Johnson, and I am a leader.
Let's have one more round of applause for Samantha's Leadership Minute. Well, good evening, and thank you for being with us. My name is Jacob Agard. For those of you that I don't know, I am the program manager of the Common Ground Initiative here in the Niskanen Center at Grand Valley. This evening's program, American Institutions, Love Them or Leave Them, introduces power dynamics and trust in institutions as the themes for the center's programming this semester. Each of our programs will build on these themes as we continue our quest for actionable common ground for the common good. Tonight's format will go as follows. We will begin with 10-minute opening remarks from both of our speakers. They'll then be joined on stage by our moderator for this evening, Darren Walhoff. Following discussion, members of the Niskanen Center staff will walk the aisles with microphones for audience Q&A. And after the presentation, copies of Ethan's Mistrust and Linda's An Unlikely Conservative will be available to purchase. They have also decided that they will sign copies, so I encourage you to purchase. And now, allow me to introduce our moderator and speakers for the evening. Darren Walhoff is Professor of Political Science and also Chair of the department here at Grand Valley. He is the author of The Democratic Theory of Hans Georg Gadamer and co-editor of The Invention of Religion, Rethinking Belief in Politics and History. His articles on hermeneutics, democratic theory, and religion and politics have appeared in Political Theory, History of Political Thought, Philosophy and Social Criticism, and Contemporary Political Theory, among other places. He teaches courses in political theory and constitutional law and was a 2015 recipient of Grand Valley's University Outstanding Teacher Award. Linda Chavez is president of the Becoming American Initiative and a senior fellow at the National Immigration Forum and the Niskanen Center. She has held several appointed positions, from White House Director of Public Liaison to Staff Director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She is author of Out of the Barrio, Toward a New Politics of Hispanic Assimilation, and An Unlikely Conservative, a transformation of an ex-liberal. Previously, she was an editor of the prize-winning quarterly journal, American Educator. She currently serves on the board of directors at AMB Industries, Inc., and on several nonprofit organizations as well. She resides in Silver Spring, Maryland. Joining Linda on stage is Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is an associate professor of public policy, information, and communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and also director of the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure. His research focuses on the use of media as a tool for social change and the use of new media technologies by activists, and also alternative business and governance models for the internet. He is the author of Mistrust, How Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them, and Rewire, Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection. Previously, he helped found Tripod.com, one of the web's first personal publishing sites. He and his family live in Berkshire County in western Massachusetts. Please help me welcome to the stage, Ethan Zuckerman.
Thanks to all of you for coming out. I know that this is still a bit of a weird moment. You know, none of us is quite sure where we are as far as the pandemic and how we're going to be in public and so on and so forth. So I just really want to appreciate all of you. I released this book in January of this year, which is a really weird time to bring out a book. And I was going to say that this is the first time I'm speaking in public about this book. Of course, that's not actually true. It is true that it's the first time that I'm speaking about this book while wearing pants. And I see some of you are wearing pants. I really appreciate the solidarity. For those of you online who are not wearing pants, that's fine. That's how I prefer to speak about this book. But I mention this because it really is a peculiar moment in American history. Not only are we wrestling with the pandemic, we're wrestling with this crisis of mistrust about whether people want to follow advice about the pandemic, whether people are going to accept vaccination. We're also wrestling with really terrifying conflicts over the very nature of our political system and the legitimacy of our elections, as exemplified in the violence that we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. So what's been interesting for me in going out and sharing some of the ideas of mistrust is realizing that this isn't necessarily just about vaccine hesitancy. It isn't just about political violence. It's not even something that is limited to the political right. I actually started writing about mistrust very much looking left and looking at movements like Occupy in the United States, looking at movements like Podemos in Europe, where what you saw were people who were not disengaged from politics, actually people who were enormously civically engaged, but who felt like their energy was not being used well in being involved with formal political processes. And the people that I saw this the most strongly with were my students at that point at MIT. These were incredibly smart kids. They cared passionately about the world that they were living in, and they really wanted to figure out how to transform it, but they were incredibly skeptical of their ability to do so through the ways they'd been told civics worked. The idea that going to the polls, or even going out in the streets and protesting, would have real meaningful change in the world was really quite foreign to them. And rather than the usual response, which is, well, we need to teach better civics, I started to take them very seriously and wanted to figure out what was actually going on. And I started doing this deep dive into the history of mistrust. We have gone through a really fascinating 50-year process from becoming an incredibly trusting nation to an incredibly mistrustful nation. So this is the same question asked every few months to Americans. Do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? If we go back to 1964, you have 77% of people saying, yes, I trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time. You ask this question right now, and you'll get somewhere between 12 and 15%. This isn't just a recent phenomenon. We've been at this very, very low level of trust throughout the Obama and Trump administrations, but actually the big slide is from the 1960s down to 1980. We hit what I like to think of as the Carter mark, at 1/4 of Americans saying that they trust the government at the end of the Carter presidency. And then we've gone back to that point several times and stayed that low. So that's a point at which only 1 in 4 Americans believes that the government is working well for them all or most of the time. What's interesting to me is that when you ask Americans about different institutions, not just the government, but about banks, about churches, about almost any large body, you get similar results, right? The institutions Americans trust the most, the only 2 where trust has increased are the military and small business. Small business isn't really an institution. That means you're trusting a person, you're trusting the business that they run. The military, in part, we trust because those numbers are up from the 1980s, where we were coming out of Vietnam. So the military is more popular than it was in Vietnam. That's probably not news. But so many of these other institutions, police, organized religion, the medical system, Supreme Court, the public schools, banks, newspapers, criminal justice system, television news, big business, and the absolute last, Congress. Not only is our confidence in these systems very low, but it has fallen sharply, often since the 1970s and the 1980s. The other thing that I would point out is that we are not alone in the United States. When we look at trust in the United States vis-a-vis other countries, the United States shows up, and of course I don't have my labels, so it's very hard to tell, but I happen to know the United States shows up here. We're next to France. We trust about as much as France does. We trust less than the United Kingdom does. All the way on the other side there is Scandinavia, but there's a lot of nations that trust even less. That's Italy down there, Greece, Spain. Many European nations are going through the same crisis. And in fact, in political science right now, this is being referred to as the deconsolidation of democracy. This was one of those papers that was so radical when it came out, it made it into the New York Times before it actually got peer-reviewed in a journal. People really wanted to talk about it. This pair of researchers looked at data decade by decade and asked people, is it essential to live in a democracy? And what's really interesting is in, for instance, the United States, if you ask people who were born in the 1930s, is it essential to live in a democracy? 75% say yes. You get down to the 1960s, and you're down below 50%. You get to the 1980s, and you're down almost as low as 25%. So there is some widespread skepticism that the systems that we live within may not be working for many people in the world. So what's done this? So one possibility is that we're just much more skeptical people. In the 1960s, very few people went to college. A lot of people didn't finish high school. We have many, many more citizens who have been taught critical thinking skills, and we see this all throughout developed democracies. Maybe we're simply becoming more skeptical and more critical citizens. Maybe it's the media. Maybe we are now in media where we can find much more criticism of the government. We know in the United States that after Vietnam, after Watergate, the press got much more aggressive, and we simply have a press that is much less likely to let things slide. Throw in the internet, where we can listen to opinions from all over the world, some well-founded, some not. Maybe that puts us in a place of very low trust. But here's some other possibilities. During that same time period that I'm talking about, inequality has risen very, very sharply in the United States, and also in a lot of the European nations that I'm talking about. And it's possible that this system that we're living within is not working extremely well for people. It's also possible that when we see institutions fail, it can take 20 or 30 years for that trust to come back. We saw, when the Boston Globe revealed the extent of corruption in the Catholic Church, a dramatic drop in faith in organized religion. We saw in 2008, with the financial market crash, a radical change in faith in banks and in big business. It can take a long time to get over a screw-up, and we've had a few screw-ups lately within some very large systems. So I am worried about this because I'm very worried that many people's response to mistrust is just to disengage. And like I said, usually what the person on stage is going to tell you is that we have to restore faith in these institutions. We need to get people to understand why they're so important. We need to get people to redouble their commitment to them. I actually want to say something slightly different, and it's this. It's okay to lose faith in institutions if those institutions are failing. What's not okay is to disengage. You actually have to engage and fight even harder to figure out how to transform those institutions. And I'll give you two tools that I end up giving my readers within the book. One is this notion of how do you stand vis-a-vis an institution. When you're looking at an institution that is not doing well, say Congress, what do you want to do? Well, there's at least three things that you can do. You can dive into that institution and try to transform it from within. You can pressure it from the outside and try to get it to behave better. Or you can do the really radical work of saying, maybe we need something radically different in this place. So here's three very quick examples of this. The Philadelphia DA's office has been taken over by a progressive prosecutor, a guy named Larry Krasner. Civil rights attorney, his entire career, had the opportunity to go in and take this job because the previous DA was horrifically corrupt, got thrown out of office, came in and did something phenomenally radical. Basically said, we're not going to be prosecuting small drug offenses. We're not going to be prosecuting prostitution. We're going to focus on major crimes. And we're not going to focus on incarceration. In many cases, we're actually going to focus on ensuring that people can stay in their communities and make restitution for their crimes. Now, this is very radical for a prosecutor, but it's not actually radical for a prosecutor's office. The notion of that office is to be the office that's bringing justice into a community. And this is what I mean by radical institutionalists. In many cases, radical institutionalists go right to the heart of what an institution is for, but perhaps go after it in a very different fashion. And I want us to find and celebrate more of these people. I want to celebrate more of these people who are pressuring institutions from outside. It's one of my favorite projects in Italy. My friend Luigi Reggi runs a project for high school students. They go out and monitor the success of their local government institutions. And what they find much of the time is that those institutions are doing really well. But the actual process of going out, auditing those institutions, visiting them, it's a very different form of civics lesson. And it gives those students real power in the way that a journalist or an investigator or an activist might end up having, and it also helps hold those institutions responsible. And finally, and maybe most radically, I think there are cases where institutions really need to be rethought. And I look at movements like Defund the Police, where you have communities that, for very understandable reasons in some cases, have very little faith in an institution. And I think it's probably a moment where we need to reimagine what public safety looks like, not to eliminate something like policing and assume that everyone is going to behave well to one another, but to say, what is it that we're trying to do in terms of public safety, and is there another way to build this? The other set of tools that I ask students to do is to look beyond law. We're used to thinking of law as what holds society together. But there's at least four forces. There's no law preventing any of you from jumping up and telling me that I'm full of crap. There are very strong social norms against it, and they end up keeping certain behaviors in place. Also, I've got a microphone, and you don't, and that's code. It's technological systems. We build certain systems that give people power to do certain things, make it harder to do other things. Finally, we have markets. We use markets to make some things cheap, some things expensive. It turns out that these 4 levers that we use to control society also become levers for change. And so it's amazing if people can go and pass laws. And it's critically important. It's how we get some of the major advances in society, like gay and lesbian rights. But it's also critically important that people figure out how to make change by changing social norms. And movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter are not so much about changing laws as they are about changing hearts and minds. And we're seeing incredible creativity with people using markets and technology to make progress around issues like climate change and to make issues like privacy, which is a longer talk. My point in this book is not that there's a particular right way to do this. It's not to argue that the job is to tear down all the institutions or that we should run into the institutions. It's to help people see that what we need is a generation that is not disengaged. And so if we can encourage people to find their own efficacy, to find their way of making an impact on the world, that's how we move forward from this moment of very high mistrust. So thank you so much. I'm thrilled that Linda gets a chance to respond. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to hand it over to my friend, Linda Chavez.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my second visit to the Niskanen Center, and it's a delight to be back. I, like Ethan, have not been out publicly speaking before a live audience in a year and a half, and it's great to get out there and actually see faces. We've even had some opportunity at mealtime and over hors d'oeuvres to actually see entire faces, not just the eyes. As you might imagine, I am a conservative, and so I disagree with some of the things that Ethan has talked about tonight. But I also agree with a great deal of what he had to say about the subject of trust, because I think we are in a crisis of trust right now. In thinking about what stage we are in preparing for this event tonight, one of the things I thought about was how I'm spending my life these days. And I am spending my life now more devoted to looking at the institution of democracy and how democracy is functioning than on almost any other subject. Immigration is the other subject that I spend a great deal of time on. So thinking about this, a movie came to mind, or actually a play originally, and that was A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt. If you haven't seen it or read it, I commend it to you. The 1966 production with Paul Scofield is, I think, one of the finest movies ever made. And A Man for All Seasons is about Sir Thomas More, later St. Thomas More, who of course was martyred for refusing to sign the king's request. The king at this point was Henry VIII, to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It was a petition that was to be sent to the Pope asking for an annulment of that marriage, and he refused and was later martyred for it. And the scene that came to mind was a scene with the character William Roper in the play. William Roper was a Lutheran, about to be his son-in-law, and they were discussing the question of law. And Roper accused Thomas More of giving the benefit of law to the devil. And this was Thomas More's response. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide? The laws all being flat. This country is planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down, and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? I think of us as at that period right now, and I look back to November and period through January 20th, as a time when there were a lot of people trying to cut down the laws. We're a constitutional republic, and the question before us tonight is whether or not we should love or leave our institutions. I think it's a false choice. I don't think we have any choice in the matter at all. In fact, because of the nature of our constitutional democracy, if we do not preserve the institutions of democracy, we as a society will fail. And it is like a house in which you take out the foundation of the house and the house collapses. We do not exist as a democratic republic if we give up on those institutions and on the laws that help create those institutions. But I say that at a time when I think we are in the most perilous period of American history, certainly that I have lived through. And I lived through the Vietnam War. I was a student on campus, a graduate student, and teaching on campuses during the Vietnam War, and we were certainly divided at that point in our history, but not as divided as I think we are today. And I look at the United States and I say, we are a nation that took on totalitarianism in Europe and defeated it in World War II. We are a nation that stood as a bulwark against communism around the world and eventually brought the USSR to its knees and to its dissolution. So how is it that today, a nation that is as prosperous as we are, as successful as we are, in which we have a very educated population, as Ethan suggested, we are more educated today than at any point in our history. We have a much more educated population. And yet, the trajectory of mistrust that Ethan talked about has certainly been a very steep downward trajectory since the 1960s. I look back on that period and I see much of the initial blame for this dissolution of trust resting on the shoulders of the progressive left. I'm very interested in issues related to race and ethnicity, to language and immigration. And I look at the period of the 1960s all the way into the mid-1990s, and I see a country that was becoming much more diverse, largely because of changes in our immigration policy. Changes, by the way, which I approve of. But I see that at least during that period of our history, the left was not interested in pulling together and creating a sense of us as one nation, indivisible, made up of many different parts, but parts that ultimately were united and had a common culture and a common language. But what has been interesting is that that kind of tribalism, I call it, that took place on the left has now infected the right as well. And it has gone beyond the kind of tribalism we think of in terms of ethnicity or even religion to a tribalism based on ideology or political affiliation. And we now have a country in which, as Ethan pointed out, the question of whether or not to wear a mask that can protect you from giving others a deadly disease, or protect somewhat less, but still importantly, protect yourself from getting a disease. The decision to take or not take a vaccine that has been administered hundreds of millions of times now, a vaccine that was developed under the previous administration but rolled out under the current administration. This has become a political issue. And what is so ironic is that, you know, we're not willing to take an FDA-approved vaccine administered hundreds of millions of times, but some of our population is willing to ingest a horse dewormer in the hopes that that is somehow going to prevent the election. Well, I look at whether or not there is anything to be hopeful for in this in this period, because I like to be a person who does see light at the end of the tunnel. And I have to tell you that I'm not terribly optimistic about how we're going to get there, but I know that we must get there, because if we don't, we will fail as a nation. And I look back on the 2020 election, and one of the things that I see about that election that was so important was that this was an election held in the most dire circumstances outside of a war, the Civil War in the United States. We've never had an election that was as challenging as the last election, and yet we had the largest turnout in voting that we have had at any period in decades, going back to at least 1980s, and some people think it goes back even further than that. And yet, after the election, we then had a dispute about who actually won that election. And polling data from the spring of this year shows that about a quarter of the United States voting population believe that Donald Trump actually won the election and that he was cheated out of it. And of that one quarter, 53% of Republicans believe that. I think that is very, very dangerous. It is very dangerous because the fundamental institution of democracy is, in fact, elections. And elections only work if everybody agrees to the outcome. And we've never had, in the history of our country, ever had a president or a candidate who ran for election for president who was not willing to accept defeat, who would not, in fact, concede that defeat, and yet we have that now. So trust is very much a problem. There is, however, one institution that I think has held very well, and I was interested to see Ethan's chart because it was an institution that doesn't score all that well in terms of trust, and that institution is the courts. In fact, the reason we had a peaceful transfer of power on January 20th can almost entirely be explained by the fact that those who thought Donald Trump won the election were able to take their views to courts, were in fact able to present evidence, and decisions were handed down. And in over 200 cases, those decisions came down and said that in fact the election was fair, that there was not widespread corruption or fraud, and that the winner of the election was as declared by the various states. That, I think, is one of the things that we can look forward to and be hopeful about. The fact is, laws are the fundamental foundation of a democratic society. And having an institution in the courts that is willing to accept the law and the interpretation of the law. And it didn't matter, by the way, whether the judges were Democrat or Republican, with actually some of the most stinging decisions being written by Trump appointees. So I would hope that we can build on that sense that at the end of the day, we may fight with each other, we may dispute each other, but at the end of the day, we were able to have one institution among many that was able to finally make sure that there was that kind of peaceful transfer of power. And I think it's incumbent on groups like this to search for that common ground, where Ethan and I will disagree certainly on defunding the police. We're going to disagree. We're going to disagree on lots and lots of policy differences. But at the end of the day, what is important is that we speak directly to each other, that we make our case, and that we try to convince each other by the strength of our ideas and our arguments, and that we do not resort to name-calling or resort to certainly any kind of violence. That is what's going to preserve this country. And I'm hopeful that with groups like the Niskanen Center, that you're going to have that kind of civic community that is able to come together to agree on what we agree on, to disagree on what we disagree on, but to always do it in an agreeable fashion. Thank you very much.
Greetings. I want to get those of you in the audience involved in this conversation. So start thinking of questions that you have for Linda and Ethan. And while you're thinking about those questions, I just want to ask a few of my own and get Ethan and Linda here in conversation together. And I want to start that by picking up on something that Linda said about tribalism and trying to connect it to some of the things that Ethan was saying about the results of these public opinion polls. And the way I want to frame the question is to ask, is the mistrust real? And what I mean by that is when people are asked whether they trust certain institutions, do they actually not trust these institutions? Or are they answering the question in a way that demonstrates their tribal loyalty, right? So when there's a survey and you ask somebody on the progressive left whether you trust the police, the correct answer is no right now, right? And yet, when someone breaks into their home, who do they call, right? So I'm trying to get at, is the trust real, or is the trust an indicator of identity, of tribal loyalty? So I don't know if you two have thoughts about that.
Actually, I think that's a very insightful question, and I think you've hit on something that's very important. I think there is a performative aspect of the way in which people respond to public opinion polls in particular. I think the whole polling industry, talk about an industry that should not be trusted, their polls haven't been accurate recently, at least not on elections. And I think the reason they've not been accurate, some of it may be that they've got the wrong demographics, that they're, under testing among voters who end up being, more conservative, or certainly the Trump voters were perhaps underestimated. But I also think that there is an aspect of people who get these calls basically playing with the pollsters, giving them the answer either that they think that's going to annoy the person on the phone, or, as you suggest, giving them an answer that is more sort of in keeping with their tribal identifications. And I think that it used to be that we could look in the Republican Party. I became a Republican under President Reagan. He was the first Republican that I voted for president. And at that time, I was what was known as a Reagan Democrat. I voted for him as a registered Democrat, but I was from a working class background, and I agreed with him on a lot of things, especially on foreign policy and defense. Wasn't so sure on some of the economic issues, but I voted for him. But at that time, there was a fairly big tent in the two parties, both in the Democratic and in the Republican Party. I mean, there were people like Lowell Weicker, Republican senator from Connecticut, whom I didn't have much use for. There were a lot of Republicans that I didn't agree with on things, but we were all comfortable to call ourselves Republicans. I think that's not true anymore, and it's one of the reasons that I ended up unaffiliating with the Republican Party in January. I mean, I was very disheartened at what was taking place in Congress and the move by Republicans in the House, but also among some senators to decertify certain states' votes. And so I, went and literally while I was watching TV, got my iPad, went to the Montgomery County, Maryland registrar's office online and re-registered as unaffiliated. And I think what's happened is there's been a kind of hardening on the Democratic side. It's a hardening to the left, and on the Republican side, a hardening. I wouldn't call it the right or conservative, because I don't think Trump was very conservative, but there is a hardening around sort of a iconic figure in the party.
So this question about political polling, I think, is a fantastic one. And we do know that there's always a gap between what people refer to as expressed preference, which is what you say you want, and revealed preference, which is actually what you do. I think one way to think about this is we have a lot of people on the right who express real skepticism about higher education, fears that it's liberal indoctrination. We have an awful lot of children of those people going to institutions of higher education.
Right.
So how do you pull that apart? I don't think that it's necessarily people being inauthentic. I actually think the way that I read those questions of mistrust is something along the lines of, do I think this institution listens to me, or people like me? Do I think it is accountable to me? Do I think that I am capable of influencing it? That's how I tend to read that question. We know, for instance, that on that question of, do you believe the government in Washington will do the right thing all or most of the time, that always moves depending on what party's in power. Mm-hmm. If your party's in power, you're 10% more likely to say that I trust, although they've been sliding on both sides of the aisle. If you are a person who's in a minority, if you're a person of color, you are much less likely to answer that question in the affirmative, although it went up during the Obama presidency. It was the sense that these institutions are answerable to people like me. That's the way that I actually think we want to understand mistrust. The real question is, am I capable of influencing this institution? My guess, Linda, is that part of your, I think, very principled decision to step away from the Republican Party was a moment at which you felt like you couldn't influence it. And I think in many cases, that's the moment where people find themselves looking at an institution and saying, either I'm going to disengage from it, I'm going to exit, or I'm going to look for another way to make change around that set of issues. And for me, it's that second path of how do I keep moving forward, even if I feel like I can't influence that institution. That, for me, is where some of the most interesting work is happening.
So that raises some really interesting questions, I think. If we think about what Ethan's calling efficacy, the ability to influence and change an institution. I mean, we necessarily live in a society and democracy of large institutions, right? We've got a large population, we've got lots and lots of large institutions. So of course you're not necessarily going to feel that you have influence in those institutions. And so I'm wondering if there's a kind of national versus local divide here as well, right? Where there's trust in local institutions, hopefully that may not necessarily be reflected in the larger institutions, and yet we're caught up in those larger institutions inevitably and don't see a sort of way around them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's not as true as it used to be. The answer used to be that people had much, much more trust in their local representatives and in their local government, their state government, than they did in federal government. One of the things that's really happened over the last 20 or 30 years, and it's had a lot to do with cable news, is that all issues are now national. And so some of this anger that we've seen, whether it's over masking or vaccines, whether it's been about the elections, you see national narratives playing out in local places. The flip side is that outside of some of those systems, people have gotten involved with national issues on a very local scale. So, for instance, think about the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement has not especially been pushing for legal change because sexual harassment has been illegal for quite some time. It's a normative change. It's this idea that we're going to start calling out behavior that people would sweep under the rug and ignore previously. That change started with the very local experience of people standing up and saying, here's what's happened to me in my place of work. And it's very quickly become a national movement. So I don't know that it's local versus national. I think it's a question of where do you feel like you can actually make progress? And this is where I've been so interested to watch people build movements that are sometimes national or international in scale, but they're able to do it because on that particular issue, with their skills and experience, they feel the ability to move the lever at that point.
I guess my response is, number one, I do think you've hit on an important point, Ethan, when you talk about whether or not you feel you have the ability to make a difference in the institution. And that was certainly part of my decision in terms of leaving the Republican Party. I hadn't changed any of my views on any of the issues, but I didn't feel comfortable trying to work within that system. I didn't think my voice would be heard. But I also think when you talk about the Me Too movement, I mean, one of the sort of interesting phenomena is that being able to speak out, being able to have a contrary point of view is getting more and more difficult on both the left and the right. And I know, for example, I've been very involved on the question of sexual harassment and sexual assault on university campuses. I was involved and supported the Trump administration's change and actually issuing regulations that granted more procedural protections to those accused, and in fact formalized the whole system, made universities have to function, not necessarily as courts, but at least giving at least some level of due process for those who were accused. Being able to speak out on those issues on a university campus, you're assumed to be a defender of rapists. You have liberal institutions, which I think play an enormous role in dictating, you talked about norms, in dictating what is acceptable, what is an acceptable point of view. I've always been somebody who believes very strongly in the importance of debate. I would far rather come and debate an issue and debate before an audience that may be skeptical of what my point of view. My point of view is, or my role is always to try to convince you to at least listen to the arguments. And then if you want to reject them, fine, but at least give me a fair chance to make the argument. And I think we're shutting down a lot of that. And I think that has been largely a phenomena of the left. And when you talk about the media, and yes, there certainly is a whole infrastructure of right-wing media. I was telling people earlier today that I was on Fox News Channel as a commentator for 14 years and was eventually fired, and I was fired, they were quite explicit with me, that I confuse people. My position on immigration, I'm in favor of broad-scale legal immigration to the United States, that confused people because it was not the conservative position. Well, it had been the conservative position for most of my time in the Republican Party, and it had shifted. So yes, there's censorship on both the right and the left, but I think that the way in which people feel intimidated about taking a point of view that may be different, that may not go in line with whatever is the group in power, is something that we've got to get back to being able to have honest disagreements and not to have them turn into screaming matches.
Yeah, great. I have many more questions, but I want to give people a chance in the audience to ask questions as well. So Grace and Sam are going to be walking around with mics. So if you would like to ask a question of Ethan or Linda or both of them, put up your hand so that Grace or Sam can find you. We've got one over there in the back to start us off.
I'm really wondering what you think of the sociologists solution to the lack of trust and the lack of unity in America, that it will take some major goal to pull us together, like World War II pulled us out of the morass that we were in before then. And I'm referring specifically to the Strauss and Howe theory. And I'm wondering what you think of that, whether that'll do it, or if it occurs.
Unfortunately, you could argue that we're facing at least two of those crises right now. We're facing the very immediate crisis of COVID, and quite clearly, that hasn't pulled us out of it. We're facing an increasingly scary climate crisis that I think there's starting to be some consensus that we're facing a very challenging minimum of 30 years ahead of us. So far, that doesn't seem to be bringing us together. It's long been a theory that a common enemy and an existential threat is capable of making allies of people who disagree. One of the things that Linda and I think have been coming back to a number of times in our discussions today is that we seem to be at a moment where we're no longer disagreeing about interpretations of facts. We're often disagreeing about facts. And at that point, we're functionally living in different universes. And so if we simply can't agree coronavirus is dangerous and 2,000 Americans are dying a day, and other people are essentially saying this is a fraud and it simply shouldn't be worried about, we can't find that common enemy. If the response is climate change isn't real or it's tremendously overestimated, it's very hard to sort of find that common ground around it. So what I have a great deal of fear over right now is this splitting of reality and this idea that we can't find common ground because we're not living in the same factual universe a good piece of the time.
You know, I think that's a good point. And, you know, I look back and among my friends, most of whom are neoconservatives and became Republicans largely around foreign policy decisions, we look back and say, boy, when we had the USSR as our enemy, we were all together. We could all be on the same team because we had a common enemy. I think for a very, very brief moment after 9/11, we had that. I mean, I remember right after the attack, some of the ads that were on television with people of various, you know, races and ethnicities and religions getting on and saying, I am an American. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought, we're finally getting back to the e pluribus unum idea that we are one nation, one people, because we were attacked from the outside. But that didn't last long. I mean, it lasted, you know, I guess probably until the Iraq War. And then the whole question of mistrust and the whole question of mistrust of government decisions that were made and decisions made by President Bush, I think put us back into, you know, our various tribal groups. And so I don't know what it is that's going to be able to bring us together. It's certainly not going to be COVID, and as you said, it's not going to be climate change either, although I do see, look, I think it's almost impossible to ignore that the climate is changing. We were talking earlier among ourselves about, I grew up in the West. We never had a fire in Colorado. There were no fires in New Mexico and Colorado that, you know, that I remember growing up. It just wasn't an issue. And now the West is burning. So the climate is changing. The real question and the real debate is how much has man's activity contributed to that change and what can we do about it and what's the best way to approach it. But I think until we get to the point when we do have a common basis of facts upon which we agree, that we can agree, you know, as I said, that the election took place, more people voted than have voted in decades, and that whether you like it or dislike it, one person won and one person didn't. And that you've got to be able to have some responsibility, and I do put, you know, a lot of onus on the leadership. I put a lot of onus for the way things have turned out on President Trump and his refusal to concede that he lost the election. And this was something that he, you know, even in 2016, he was asked, are you going to accept the result of the election? And he said, it depends on if I win. Well, and that was the way it was again in 2020. So, you know, the sort of basic decency, the basic agreement that we have a set of rules and we abide by those rules, it's like a sports team. I mean, what would happen in the NFL or the NBA? You know, if one team said, well, that was an unfair call, and so, yeah, it looked like we lost the game, but we didn't. We actually won. You can't have a functioning society when you don't have leaders who agree to accept the rules of the game.
Someone else, so up here first and then right there.
To me, the elephant in the room is what's happening in Texas right now. I would like your opinions, and then what Roe Wade was done by the Supreme Court today, I find very disturbing as a woman.
I'm going to respond to that first because I know that, you know, when I was talking about the courts, it occurred to me, oh, well, you know, the Supreme Court handed down this decision and it was 5-4 with Justice Roberts joining with the more liberal members of the court. I am not 100% certain that I am reading what they did as drastically as the supporters of Roe v. Wade are reading it. From my point of view, I have, on the life issue, I have always, I'm a Catholic, and so I, you know, accept the Catholic Church's position on abortion, but I also believe in a pluralist society and a society in which, you know, you have a state like Louisiana and Texas and a state like New York and Maine, that there are going to be different norms and different attitudes. And so I actually, you know, thought that the best way to approach it was to allow states to have different laws. And some states are going to have laws that are more restrictive than others. But I think that the Texas law is so bizarre as a law as to, I will find it very hard to believe that the Supreme Court would in fact uphold that law were it to come before it. It is basically a law that encourages individuals to sue and to get a bounty for it, to get a $10,000 payment for suing anyone who they said aided or abetted an abortion. You know, if I don't like the fact that, you know, somebody in Texas got an abortion, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I have played one on TV many times. And, you know, I don't know what the tort is. What damage has been done to me because you had an abortion in the state of Texas? How is it that I am entitled to be compensated because you did something I disapprove of? Just as a matter of law, I think it's a very strange law. So the fact that they didn't take it up, I am not assuming that that means that were it to come to the court, that all of the conservative members of the court would vote to uphold it. I would find that very strange, and I just don't think that's going to happen.
I really appreciated that you ended your remarks with optimism, Linda, and I do think that in most democracies, the courts are really the bedrock that sort of allows us to keep the whole system running. You did point out from the charts that I was showing that the confidence in the courts is actually quite low compared to other institutions. I feel like, certainly over my lifetime, the courts have become much more politicized. And I think we took some very big steps on politicization with the refusal to have hearings on Merrick Garland. I think the real shift in the court under the Trump administration certainly leaves a lot of people on the left feeling very uncertain about the court. I hope you're right. I hope that when the Texas law or when a similar law gets a proper hearing, we will actually have the Supreme Court weigh in on Roe. And personally, I hope it's affirmed and I hope it's strengthened. What I worry about is that it is such a charged issue that this unwillingness to take it up at this moment looks a lot like a pathway towards a country coming further apart, which is to say that we can predict states that are likely to put very strong restrictions on abortion, and a process that honestly has been going on throughout my whole lifetime, which is really sort of slow migration of people towards states where they feel better represented and more comfortable. This may further push us in that direction. Yeah. So I'm a little worried about that. I will add with one note of optimism on all of this. I noted with no small pride that kids on TikTok have organized a campaign to functionally shut down the Texas system where you can report someone for having an abortion by simply spamming it with millions of reports. And I think that's an appropriate response to an idea that is so phenomenally stupid that I think you and I, even if we agree on very little, can agree on the stupidity of that idea.
By the way, I think this is going to be the big fundraising opportunity and a big boon to Democrats in the next election. I think a lot of people, who are, basically pro-choice, or at least pro-choice for at least sort of in the middle on the issue, they've sort of been able to take for granted that Roe was there and that it was not really threatened, and I think this is actually going to redound to the benefit of the Democrats, not the Republicans.
There's a question here.
Thank you. I want to go back to a question about the institutions themselves. We quite often talk about institutions as they have life of their own, and they're not. They're just buildings and things. And we talk about the lack of leadership. Well, the leadership is the people in those buildings and how we go about selecting them, and if they don't succeed, how we replace them. And I've been in the business world my whole life. But I worked a lot with Department of Defense, a lot of government agencies, and I saw how difficult it was to remove people that weren't performing their jobs compared to private industry, where if people are not performing the jobs quite often, they'll get away with it for a year or two, and then either the board or the company will replace them. So my question is, how do we get the kind of leadership we need, and what is the role education and the media plays in either helping us do this or making it even worse to start solving some of these issues? I don't think it's a problem as much as we haven't figured out a way to find the right kinds of leaders. I think there's a lot of great people out there. But you think there's like 3 or 4 senators in the United States if you watch the news. You think there's only 4 or 5 representatives. You don't hear from all the others. And I think the media is to blame for that by selectively deciding who they're going to have on. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So it's the very nature of an institution to perpetuate itself. And part of that's a good thing, right? You actually want, when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, to have someone give you service, and it doesn't matter whether it's James or Janice behind the desk, and James is an idiot, everyone knows that, Janice is the competent one. Ideally, an institution treats you the same way no matter who's in charge, and no matter who's in the lead of it. But the price that you sort of end up paying for that is that institutions perpetuate themselves. People learn to work within those institutions, they find protection within them, and they're very unwilling to sort of give up that power. One of the institutions I talk about a lot in the book is Congress. I talk about this very radical, but actually very old idea that Congress should probably be a whole lot bigger than it is, that it should really be a people's house and should be much more representative of the people. Congress has not done a meaningful reapportionment since the 1920s. Why? Congress people enjoy having power. If there were twice as many Congress people, they would have half as much power. And so it's very, very hard to get people to cede that sort of power. One of the things private industry has often done very well is revolutionary change, right? Think of an institution like the phone company. Another moribund institution has a very hard time finding good leadership, And then suddenly we have mobile phones. And suddenly we have Skype and Zoom. And what had been an enormously profitable institution disappears. Remember MCI? Like, that was a real company at one point. And it's just sort of dissolved into the ether because there was a radical change there. One of the things that we need to figure out is how to have that cycle of healthy disruption around other institutions. You can't just have your state government disappear. That would be really, really bad. At the same time, we know that institutions calcify, that those people who gain power end up sort of staying in place. So one of the things that's very interesting is that my guess, based on reading Federalist and some of the other early documents, is that the framers of the Constitution did not expect the document to be as unchanging as it has been. They did not expect it to remain as close to the original as it ends up having been. They were really anticipating quite a bit more change. I think you can see that quite literally in 10 amendments within the first 10 years of the Constitution. But we've calcified, and it's gotten harder and harder to do. And that's one of the areas where I think we really do need to do some rethinking and reimagining, because I think that moment of saying this institution just isn't working very well anymore, I think happens more often than honestly, I think any of us are particularly comfortable with.
I do think Congress is not working as it was intended. And I do believe that the political system that we have now and the apportionment system that we have now is a disservice to democracy. I think the fact that you have so few competitive seats in the United States Congress, the way in which legislatures draw district lines, whoever happens to be in control of the legislature, whichever party, is going to obviously try to skew it towards its own benefit. And what that's done is it has made it much, much more difficult to see a kind of turnover and change within parties. And I think our system of picking presidents needs some rethinking. I think the way in which the various party primaries work throughout the election cycle do not always produce the best candidates. And so I do think there's some room for trying to rethink some of these things. I wish I had the answers. I don't, but I do think that it's important to realize that just because we've done it this way for a long time doesn't mean that we have to continue to keep doing it this way, because something clearly is broken. Something isn't working. One of the things, I mean, it's a small thing, but having been, a Washingtonian living in Washington, working in Washington since the early 1970s, the way in which members of Congress now spend so little time in Washington, D.C., and so much time going back and campaigning and raising funds for their next election has meant that you don't develop the kind of relationships that, for example, Ethan and I have today. We've had meals together, we've had talks. We fundamentally disagree on lots of things, but we can work together, and we could work together to look for solutions. You don't see that happening much in Congress. Yeah, there is the Problem Solvers Caucus, I guess, which has recently sprung up. But by and large, you don't see the kind of cross-fertilization across the aisle with relationships developing, with people, you can't get up and call somebody a bad name if they sat at your dinner table the night before. It just wouldn't work. It doesn't happen. There's the story, and it was an accurate story of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan getting on the telephone, and talking every week and having a good laugh and a pleasant conversation. And obviously they didn't agree on very much of anything. But that relationship, that working relationship, allowed things to get done. And that has been broken. And one of the simple and easy things I think we could do would be to get away from having members of Congress spend so much time not talking to each other, not being on the floor of the House, not actually having to sit there and work together, but rather running back again to their own tribe and talking to people who are going to raise money for them for the next election. This is very, very corrosive of that kind of cooperation.
So maybe time for one more here, or two more. We'll take this one and one here.
Thank you. I was born in the late 40s. I'm at the front end of the baby boom. I'm 72 now. I've been in engineering and information technology for my career. I'm retired. Here's a couple perceptions I have to throw out, and then I'm going to ask a question. First of all, I perceive that over the last 20 years especially, World Wide Web enabled platforms created direct personal access to, in quotes, information that reinforces our individual personal beliefs. It's a strong influence on our culture and the way we work together. In an earlier time, in parentheses, institutions underpinned our quote-unquote reality. How can we agree on a common reality today without the aid of monstrous disasters to push us together?
So it's a great question, and it's a huge one, right? So let me start with this question of whether the web is to blame for our current moment. One of the reasons I was interested in going back in time into the 1960s and 1970s was that we actually have this enormous slide in confidence in government through the 70s. And the 70s it's a fascinating decade, right? We're really challenged by the limits of what it means to be America. We've just fought an extremely unsuccessful war. We're in a rough economic moment. We're suffering post-Watergate, a leadership crisis. We really have a crisis of identity that sets up your friend Reagan, who is able to come in and really recreate that US identity. But that crisis of confidence there suggests to me that the web may certainly have a piece to do with this, but it can't take all the blame. And we see some of those corrosions of confidence in other institutions going back as far as well. What the web has done, really amplified by this wave of social media, which is ad-supported, and what ad-supported media wants you to do is to keep watching. It's the same thing as cable news. It just wants your attention. And because it wants your attention, it's going to keep giving you what you want. So it's really, for me, a through line from CNN and Fox News through to this very weird media landscape that we live in right now online, where we both have that fragmentation of reality and we have easy access to the stuff that we want and not much access to the stuff that makes us uncomfortable. So I think it's enormously important, but I don't think it's causal. As for what we do, I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with bridge building on small scales. And I'm very grateful that we're coming together and having a conversation like this. What's likely to happen is that Linda and I both sit on panels and commissions and so on and so forth. At some point, someone's going to call her up and say, who's a lefty who knows about technology who isn't totally nuts? And she may think of me. And someone's going to call me up and say, I'm looking for someone who's coming from the right, but who isn't off the wall on immigration. I'm going to think of Linda. And those ties help bring us into a common reality. That experience of listening to someone who I respect immensely disagree with me profoundly and then have to deal with that. Linda's big challenge to me in this conversation has been the ways in which left-wing culture of the 1990s, really what I was brought up in, may be responsible for some of this tribalism that I'm so scared of today. But I have to take that seriously because I take this woman very seriously. So the more of that we can do, somewhere I think that's a bedrock in healing these divides that we're dealing with.
Let me take a slightly different tack on this. I consider myself a very ideological free marketeer. I learned that I was a conservative in my, I guess it was my late 20s or early 30s, when I decided I was going to read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And I read that, and suddenly the world made sense to me. He explained everything just as I experienced it. And so I've been a very big champion of the free market. But one thing about markets is that markets are driven by the profit motive. And if you can make money doing one thing as opposed to doing another thing, you're going to do the thing that makes you more money. And what I see happening, and when you talk about the World Wide Web and the internet, what has happened is that these social networks that have developed, like Facebook, like YouTube, like Instagram, like all of these, Twitter, all of them, is that they make money by essentially driving people to their own tribe, to people who agree with them. So that if you go on Facebook, you and I could be friends on Facebook, but not see the same feed because your circle of friends may be very different than my circle of friends, and we're going to be driven in different directions. If I pick something on YouTube to watch, they're going to assume, the algorithm setters are going to assume that I want to see more like that. Well, I'm one of those sort of strange people who like to, read things that I disagree with. So I, get driven in different directions than I actually agree with. But most people aren't that way. Most people want, to be reaffirmed. They want their opinions to be echoed. They want to believe, yeah, well, so-and-so agrees with me, so, it shows that, how smart I am. I'm right. And I think that's one of the problems. And when I think about, all of this and how it relates to markets, one of the things I like to remind people of is that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He happened to have considered that book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the more important of the two. And in that book, the whole way in which capitalism works is dependent on having a population that is not entirely governed by profit, but in fact has certain moral values and beliefs that undergird that, so that you act not always driven by what's going to make you richer, but also driven by a sense that you live in a community, that charitable acts are good, that you have a higher purpose in life than simply accumulating wealth. And I think we've lost a lot of that. And some of that goes back to the failures of institutions, the failures of the various churches. The Catholic Church lost tremendous amount of respect and confidence as a result of the scandals with sexual abuse in the church. Many of the evangelical churches, some of the big preachers that it turned out were, hypocrites and were only about getting money, and ended up, some of them, like the bakers, going to jail. That undercut confidence in those. And we haven't yet sort of found a way to replace that trust and that faith. But without it, I don't think a democratic society can survive. I really do believe that you have to have the kind of norms that you talked about. There has to be an agreement of a certain kind of civil behavior. And I think the schools are not doing a good job of inculcating those kinds of values. And I've been involved in that a very long time, going back to the 1970s, when I was with the American Federation of Teachers and put together teaching materials to help teachers teach about things like honesty and courage and loyalty. Values that are necessary to any society, but are particularly important in a democratic society. So the schools, I think, are one of the places where we can begin to try to redo that again.
Great. So one brief last question, and maybe brief responses.
We'll do our best.
Hi there. This is a question for the both of you. Ethan, on your point of us having to engage with our institutions to reform them, and Linda, with your experience being alienated from your political party. And I'd like you two to reflect on a few conundrums that I've found on Grand Valley's campus. The first of all being students who are not actively involved in politics or studying it are afraid to get involved with it because they don't want to deal with the repercussions of taking stances and making those stances public. And how can our democracy continue if its citizens are afraid to get involved in politics?
Great question. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it first. You know, I learned this very, very early in my public life. When I was appointed by President Reagan as head of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I took some positions which were very unpopular in the media, very unpopular among elites. And I learned that I had to have a thick skin and that no job was ever going to be more important to me than my own sense of being able to live within my own skin. That at the end of the day, I had to go home, I had to face my husband and my children, and I had to feel that I had done what I thought was the right thing. Now, it may not always have been the right thing, but I had to feel comfortable that within my own framework that I acted honorably. And I think one of the most important things in teaching young people is that popularity isn't the most important thing in the world. That sometimes you have to do what's right, and you have to take a stand, and you have to be willing, you know, to stand up for what you believe in. Because I think that's the only way that we're ever going to see the kind of reform. Now, it's true that I, you know, unaffiliated with the Republican Party, but doesn't mean that I'm not still, you know, actively working in Republican circles, trying to promote candidates that I think are good candidates. Certainly doesn't mean that I'm not going to vote for a Republican again. I voted, you know, Republican in the last elections for everything except the presidency. And so I think being willing to stand up for what you believe in is so important, and learning that at the end of the day, it's always more important to be able to feel that what you've done with a clear conscience, and that you haven't, you know, been somebody who could bend in the wind. I think that's so important, and I don't know exactly how you instill that in the young, but I think that's the single most important lesson you can learn in life, is that you've got to do what you think is right, and even if it doesn't make you the most popular person on the block.
And I'll add an educator's perspective to that, which I think ends up being complementary, but from a slightly different point of view. The worst classes are the ones where everybody agrees with everyone else. They're just boring. You don't learn anything. I am always grateful when I have students who hugely disagree with me come into class. It takes a long time sometimes to get them to trust that I want to hear what they have to say. And I am going to challenge them on making arguments that are factual, making arguments that are complex, engaging with the text. But I'm so grateful that someone is out there ensuring that we're looking from issues from multiple different perspectives. Because if I don't have students do that, I have to do it myself. And you'll see good teachers building syllabi that aren't designed to indoctrinate, they're designed to give you multiple different points of view in an argument. You'll find most good educators often arguing perspectives that they frequently don't personally hold, because what we're really trying to do is get you to look at things from different sides. So I would ask you in some ways to make a bit of a leap of faith. You may have educators who come from a different political point of view than you do, and they may be enormously grateful for your presence in class as being someone who is smart and engaged with the text, and disagreeing with them. You may be a fantastic foil for the rest of the class. And so I guess what I would urge you is very much, you have to take the principled stand. You have to stay true to your belief, but also have some faith that this is actually how the system works at its very best, is that we all learn from that disagreement.
Good note to end on. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh,
It was
thank
really
you, Joe.
enjoyable.
Thanks.